Outburst, a Todd Mills Mystery, Book 4. Author, R.D. Zimmerman. Publisher, Scribble Pub, Minneapolis, Minnesota, 1998. Narrator, Eric Ost. Chapter 27. Once he'd spoken to Janice, Todd sat down at his desk and stared at the wall. He thought of himself and his closeted days. He thought of Tim, the film star, and the false image he projected. And he thought of Christopher. Chris. What did it all imply? That every gay person was a pathological liar? Certainly not, thought Todd. Nor were gays innate liars either. He wasn't enough of a fool, however, to not recognize how easily and naturally all gays could lie, just as he had done for almost all his adult life, simply because their safety had depended on it for so very, very long. As a survival technique over the centuries, gay people had learned what truth to give to which person and when, if at all, which meant getting to the truth of Kenny wasn't going to be an easy process, nor was it going to be easy regarding Mark Forrest. What were the secrets of his sex life? Todd now saw it more clearly than ever, understood that his hunt for the truth would probably entail peeling away many layers of many lies. Reaching for a legal pad on the side of his desk, Todd read down his notes until he came to the name of the cop killed in California. Next, turning to his computer, he punched a couple of keys and his screen throbbed to colorful life. Disregarding the first image that surfaced, that of a half-finished game of solitaire he'd been playing a couple of days ago, Todd plunged on. Like all things in this age, his hunt would start here. The Minneapolis-St. Paul area was in the top 15 large market television category, particularly now that it was feeding its programming via satellite to a Canadian cable company. In terms of quality, however, it was considered to be in the top 3, vying not against New York or Chicago or Los Angeles, but Atlanta and Denver, and according to Minnesota chauvinism, and maybe just a few unbiased others, actually winning. What that primarily meant to Todd was that not only were the production standards high at WLAK, but that he had access to a vast array of the best equipment and services, such as almost every database available in the country. Thinking he could later get from Rollins a printout from the National Crime Information Center, which would include relatively dry, straightforward information from police wants to fingerprint details like central pocket loop whirls, Todd decided to start elsewhere. He typed in his username and password. The computer dialed in, and the vast world of LexisNexis opened onto Todd's desk. It didn't take long to get things going and find what he wanted. He had 2 initial options of how to enter the system, news or people, and he chose the first. If nothing turned up, he'd later search the people section for a mention of Kenny. His next choice was whether to peruse magazines, major papers, wires, or newsletters, and his automatic choice was to go in on newspapers. When a mostly blank screen appeared before him, Todd entered a series of keywords, typing Kenny and Revell and police and murder. He paused a moment, considered adding a couple of additional keywords, but then decided against it. For now, he wanted as broad a search as possible. He'd be more specific later, when and if he wanted to narrow his hunt. He hit the enter key, and then waited as the system flashed the words, "Nexus is working on the displayed request." In the next few seconds, Todd feared that LexisNexis would flash back that it had no stories, but instead, Todd got a total of 9 hits. Immediately, Todd punched the CITE function key at the top of the keyboard, and 9 blips appeared in chronological order, listing the journal, the date of the story, the headline, and a synopsis of the text. Quickly scrolling through them all, Todd noted that 7 were from the Los Angeles Times and 2 from the Duluth Tribune. Apparently, thought Todd, settling into this, there was no lack of information on whatever had taken place in California. The question was how it would or wouldn't tie in to the murder of Sergeant Mark Forrest. Here in Minneapolis, and most importantly, whether or not it would indicate if Kenny was a fledgling serial killer. If so, if Kenny was making a morose career of this kind of murder, were there just these two killings, or had he perhaps left a trail of dead police officers across the country? That Todd realized was something he'd have to check into. A listing including dates and locations of cops killed over the last couple of years, completely unaware of what he would find, yet intuitively certain that this hunt was going to take him somewhere. A rush of excitement swelled through Todd. He glanced at his watch, saw that it wasn't even 8:30, which meant he had plenty of time before the 10 at 10 broadcast. He switched from the synopsis to the full text, and the keywords he had entered stared out at him in bold typeface each and every time they appeared in the text of the stories, starting with the first article, which appeared the morning after the murder of Los Angeles cop Dave Revelle, a year and a half ago. Todd read them in order, one after the other. In the beginning, Todd understood the case seemed pretty open and shut, or so it was portrayed by the media. On a pleasant Saturday night in Los Angeles, a series of screams from an efficiency apartment rented to Christopher Lewis Kinney broke the stillness. Moments later, a single gunshot exploded. And there was a moment of quiet, then one large shriek. The neighbor across the open-air landing, a guy by the name of Tom Babcock, heard the shot, the screams, and rushed over. He banged on the door, hollered to see if everything was all right, and then opened the door, which was unlocked. Sobbing on the floor in a skimpy, blood-spattered dress was Kitty, whom everyone in the apartment building actually believed to be a beautiful 20-something girl by the name of Chris. Across from Kenny, slumped on the couch, was the body of a young man, Sergeant David Revelle, his blue police shirt and several pairs of shoes, both his and hers, on the floor. A third of David's head was blown away from a gunshot wound, and blood was pumping from the body onto the couch and floor. On the carpet in front of Dave lay a pistol. This was what the neighbors saw, and also exactly what the police found less than 4 minutes later, when a nearby squad car responded to the neighbors' 911 call. As far as the two cops could tell, Kenny had not moved an inch, for none of the blood around her was smeared. Rather, she just sat there, eyes and mouth opened in horrified shock. In fact, she wouldn't move even when called to, and they had to lift her away. So far, thought Todd, scrolling from one article to the next, it seemed about as straightforward as could be. One body, one obvious suspect. It was no wonder that Christopher Lewis Kennedy, a.k.a. Chris, was booked in charge that very night with the murder of police officer Dave Revelle, and given that this was all about a cop killing, it was completely understandable why he was held without bail. But the truth, Todd knew from both his personal as well as his professional lives, was rarely a superficial thing. Not something that lay like an oil slick on the surface of deep waters, particularly in something so complicated as death. Yet, with each sentence Todd read, it looked more and more certain that Kenny had in fact killed Sergeant Revelle. The medical examiner's report, which came back the next day, was equally damning. According to the Los Angeles Times, in a subsequent article, the ME's office confirmed beyond a doubt not only that the weapon used to kill Dave Revelle was police-issued, but that in fact Kenny's fingerprints were on the handle of the gun. Mention was then made of Kenny's sexuality. Yes, he'd been dressed as a woman when the murder was committed, and yes, he was gay, the very mention of which made Todd flinch. For it was something about the way it was phrased, or was it the placement of the sexual revelation in the story? For whatever reason, though, the reporter's wording made it sound as if Kenny was guilty simply because he was homosexual, which in turn reminded Todd of older movies and books where queer people were portrayed as one of two aberrations. Either the repulsive villain who couldn't control himself, or the pathetic, limp-wristed victim who more or less deserved to be killed. So how, wondered Todd, flipping to the next article, did they know Kenny was gay? Had Kenny simply told them, or had the media jumped to conclusions assuming that since he was dressed as a woman, he was homosexual? Todd would have to follow up on that, for a man in a skirt didn't equal a homo. Absolutely not. The spectrum of cross-dressing was much broader than that, with heterosexual transvestites, straights who cross-dressed as a way to arouse themselves sexually on one end, and transsexuals, those who had sexual reassignment on the other. Todd sat back for a moment and rubbed his eyes. Wait a minute, he thought. What the hell had Sergeant Revell been doing there in Kenny's apartment in the first place? Most murders, of course, took place in the heat of passion, so if the two of them, Christopher Kenny and Dave Revell, had been sexually intimate, just what was the nature of their relationship? And there was no telling yet how far this story would actually go. He'd do the story at 10, then follow up once or twice tomorrow. But experience had told him the public's attention would soon start to lag, and before that happened, to be sure, WLAK management would sure as hell pull Todd from the story. That meant that at best, Todd would have only until Mark Forrest's funeral, which would be attended by family and friends and thousands of cops, and would be covered at length by all the media, print and broadcast, to come up with something that would keep this thing alive. Broadcast journalism, in particular television, was getting more and more shit these days for its lack of depth in reporting, but that, Todd felt, said as much about the American public's attention span as anything else. Returning to the screen, Todd read on about the murder in Los Angeles. Sergeant Dave Revell had been recently divorced, and what, Todd mused, was the story there, and was survived only by his mother, Roseanne, who was struck so hard by the news that she was immediately put on medication, and by his younger brother, Ron, who was described as shattered. Hoping they wouldn't be too hard to reach and that they would agree to talk to him, Todd jotted down their names, then continued. By the afternoon of the following day, Kenny had hired an attorney, Joan Ryan, who came forward insisting absolutely and completely that Christopher Lewis Kenny was innocent. There was a struggle involving the weapon, but Christopher most definitely did not pull the trigger. Clearly, this is not a case of murder, but suicide. She was quoted in the Los Angeles Times. I've met at length with my client, and I intend to prove his innocence in a court of law. Todd next came to an article in the Duluth Tribune reporting that one of northern Minnesota's native sons had been arrested in California for killing a cop. Again, there was mention both of young Christopher's sexuality and that he was presumed by all in Los Angeles to be a woman, leaving readers to cast their own stones. The damage to the Kenny family reputation, though, surely had to have been significant, for his parents, Marie and Joseph, were identified specifically that Joseph had served with the Duluth police for over 20 years. It was a fact that jumped out at Kit Todd, definitely suggesting another avenue to explore. On his pad of paper, Todd jotted, "What is Kenny's relationship with the father? Was there any physical abuse? What does father think of gays?" As surely and easily as the case had been built against Christopher Lewis Kenny, however, it unraveled just as quickly. A mere 4 days after the murder and just 3 days after the medical examiner's report, the medical examiner himself was stopped for driving under the influence. It was a scandal that swept across the front pages of the papers, and it was more than enough ammo for attorney Joan Ryan. "For God's sake," she was quoted, "what kind of butchering has he been doing? How many autopsies has this man done while drunk? To call for a prosecuting attorney and medical examiner from another city to reevaluate the case, which was exactly what took place. Not even 24 hours after Sergeant Dave Revell was laid to rest with great mourning from thousands of the LAPD, his body was exhumed from the dark and placed again in the scrutiny of light. And the findings of the second report couldn't have been more shocking. Much to the chagrin of the police and the horror of the Revell family, The second medical examiner supported Christopher Lewis Kinney's claims. Both men were right-handed indeed. Only the prints of Christopher's right hand were found on the gun, yet the bullet wound was not on the left side of Ravel's head, but on the right. Furthermore, the powder burns, the angle of the bullet, and the immense damage to the skull, which was horribly shattered, confirmed that the weapon had been fired point blank. This raised considerable doubt on Kinney's ability to move around to Ravel's right side and fire the gun, and then sit down opposite him. And while Kinney was splattered with blood, he'd definitely not been smeared, nor had he left any bloody tracks, as would have been the case had he physically traversed the scene. Furthermore, Sergeant Dave Ravel's personal medical files confirmed that he was distraught over his divorce and that he was not only taking Prozac for depression, but had been identified as suicidal. And finally, someone looked up and spoke with Ravel's former wife, who admitted that she and her husband had divorced over issues of his sexuality, specifically his homosexuality. In no uncertain terms, she told the investigators that she dumped her husband when she found him in bed with a FedEx man. What we have here, pronounced Joan Ryan in an interview to all the press, is clearly a case of a confused cop who could not come to terms with his being gay. He and my client, who cared deeply for him, were beginning a relationship, but unfortunately, Mr. Ravel felt it easier to take his own life than to face the truth. Sadly, this is all about homophobia and self-hate. That afternoon, the judge tossed out the case, feeling that guilt beyond a reasonable doubt could not be established, and Christopher Lewis Kinney was released. The second to the last article was again from the Duluth Tribune, a short piece that reported that the charges against Kinney had been dropped. When asked how he felt about all this, Kinney's father, Officer Joseph Kinney, simply said, "As far as I'm concerned, my son is dead." Moving on, Todd came to the final article in the database, which was dated the very next day. Ninth story of Level 1, printed in full format. Copyright Times, Mirror Company, Los Angeles Times, Home Edition. Section Metro. Part B, page 24. Length 265 words. Headline: More difficulties for policeman's family. Body: Roseanne Ravel, age 63. Mother of Sergeant Dave Ravel, who died last week of an apparently self-inflicted gunshot wound, suffered a debilitating stroke Friday afternoon at her home in Los Angeles. Her only surviving relative, her son, Ron, was at her side when she collapsed in her living room. Thanks in large part to her son's efforts and those of an emergency medical team who were summoned, Mrs. Ravel was quickly stabilized and rushed to a nearby hospital. Since the death of her son, Sergeant Ravel, in what at first was widely believed to be a homicide, Mrs. Ravel had been on medication and under the supervision of her doctor. A Friday afternoon, however, reporters descended upon her house, telling her that the charges against Christopher Lewis Kinney, the young man dressed as a woman who had been arrested for Sergeant Ravel's murder, were dismissed, and he was being released. When asked if she thought her son was gay and that he had killed himself, Mrs. Ravel burst into tears and retreated into her house. Approximately 1 hour later, Mrs. Ravel suffered her stroke. The story went on to recapitulate the strange events of the prior week, noting that Christopher Kinney's release was prompted when the initial report from the medical examiner was found to be faulty. The reporter went into detail about the drunk medical examiner, who had been relieved of his duties without pay pending an investigation, and added a quote from Kinney's attorney, Joan Ryan, who regretted the entire tragedy. The story concluded with a few words about and from Ron Ravel. This leaves Ron Ravel, age 28, just 16 months younger than his brother Dave, to deal with the family tragedy. 9 years earlier, his father, Thomas Ravel, was killed in an automobile accident. "As far as I'm concerned," said Ron Ravel, "Chris Kinney killed not only my brother, but also robbed my mother of her life. Her stroke was massive and she will only partially recover. The doctors say she will need full-time care from now on, the cost of which hopefully will be covered by the settlement from Dave's life insurance. As far as my brother, I know he didn't kill himself over questions of sexuality. I'm gay, and Dave had virtually no issues with that. Besides, this is California. These are the 90s. Being gay is just not enough of a reason to blow your brains out. And now my mother's life is ruined all because of this. It's horrible, senseless. And that, thought Todd, reading and rereading the last few sentences, was an extremely valid point. Not only was Sergeant Dave Revelle apparently close to his brother, who was openly gay, but surely he knew numerous gay people. Undoubtedly, he came across them on a daily basis. After all, he lived in L.A. There were millions of queers out there. Hollywood was swarming with them. All you had to do was drive down Santa Monica Boulevard at night to see scores of gay men strolling along, holding hands. So what could possibly have been the big deal? What could he have been so upset about? The sad truth was that perhaps now there would never be any knowing. While right then and there it seemed impossible to Todd that a California man could commit suicide over sexuality issues, Todd could, in fact, emphasize, not so very long ago, there had been a time in his own life when it seemed as if the world hinged on Todd's sexuality. His own homophobia had led him down some path into a dark cave where his fears had grown to nightmarish proportions. He'd been terrified what his friends and family would think if they knew the truth about him, how they would react, how they would reject him, how hurt and supposedly disappointed his father would have been. Later, he'd been fearful not only of losing his job, but ending his career in broadcast, and he'd been upset that if he didn't marry and have kids, the family would die out. It had all seemed so monumental, so insurmountable. Yet now all that was gone disappeared as if it had been that, and only that. A hideous nightmare, vanquished by some kind of light. So, Dave Revelle, who were you? And what were you doing there with Christopher Lewis Kinney? Staring at the last article, Todd knew there was only one place to dig, and that he had in fact found it. The younger brother, who not only knew Sergeant Dave Revelle better than anyone else, but who was also quite sure of Kinney's guilt. And maybe, just maybe, Ron Revelle would finally prove to be right. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.